Good afternoon to all of you. And let me begin by saying that I am really delighted to be here with Secretary Hagel at the Australia-United States ministerial meeting. This is my first AUSMIN, as we call it, in Australia. And I really want to thank Foreign Minister Bishop and Defense Minister Johnston for their unbelievably warm welcome over the course of these 2 days. We had a very productive dinner discussion last night just over the way from here. And today we both joined together in thanking Governor General Cosgrove for opening up his magnificent residence to us. It afforded a really superb venue to be able to sit here quietly and be able to really dig in very personal ways to very complicated issues. And we thank them for this special venue and special friendship that goes with it. Secretary Hagel and I both want to begin any comments that we make here today with an expression of our deepest condolences to the families and the loved ones of the 38 Australians who lost their lives in the Flight 17, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. We both want to affirm to Australia and to the world that we absolutely demand, as does Australia, justice for this unconscionable crime. And just as we stand together on so many issues, from the Asia-Pacific to the Middle East to Afghanistan and beyond, we will see this through together. I've also had the very good fortune to work with our Australian friends for many years, 29 years in the United States Senate, and a number of years as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So when Secretary Hagel and I served in Vietnam, slightly different times, but we both served there, we also fought alongside, side by side, with our Australian brothers, who were great soldiers and great friends. In fact, Australian men and American men and women on both sides, have fought side by side in every major conflict since World War I. And we're proud of the friendship and the trust, as Minister Johnston was just saying, that has grown out of this long-time relationship. I was very privileged to join Secretary Hagel and Foreign Minister Bishop and Defense Minister Johnston last year at Arlington National Cemetery, where we honored this special bond between Australians and the United States, a bond that can only be forged through the sacrifice of war, which we both understand. So I thank Australia at this moment particularly for stepping up yet again with their offer of humanitarian assistance in Iraq at this moment of crisis. The new Iraqi leadership has a very difficult challenge. It has to regain the confidence of its citizens by governing inclusively, but also by taking steps to demonstrate their resolve. And we're going to continue to stand with the Iraqi people during this time of transition. And though we live in different hemispheres and at opposite ends of the globe, the United States could ask for no better friend and no closer ally than Australia. Australia is a vital partner in so many different endeavors. It is vital as we deepen the U.S. economic engagement throughout the Asia-Pacific, as we engage in the rebalance, as both ministers have referred to it, which will bring the United States even more to the effort to help create a larger economic transformation in the region and to bring about a rule of law-based structure where everybody understands the rules and where it is a race to the top, not to the bottom. We also are working hard together to try to complete a critical component of that race to the top, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. We also discussed, as has been mentioned by both ministers, difficult regional and global security challenges. We didn't need to struggle to find commonality in our understanding of the fact that we are living in one of the most complicated moments of transformation and transition all across this planet. Instant communications, massive numbers of mobile devices, massive amounts of information moving at lightning speed around the globe, informing everybody about everything all of the time. And that has changed politics, and it has changed international relations. It raises expectations among people all over the world, and it challenges politics in terms of building consensus around decisions. So we face a lot of these challenges together in today's world, and that is why it is so important to have the kind of discussion that we had here today, where we lay out every one of those challenges and try to figure out, how do we do this better? How can we have greater impact? How do we bring more people to the table in order to affect change? It has enabled both of our countries to stand with the people of Ukraine, support long-term progress in Afghanistan, reduce tensions in the South China Sea, collaborate in the United Nations Security Council on everything from Iran to Syria to restricting trade in illicit small arms and weapons, and even in our fellow human beings. Today's session allowed us to consult and coordinate in depth on these issues and on the challenges that we face in Iraq and Gaza. And we also agreed, in conjunction with our discussion about the foreign fighters that Julie raised a moment ago, that we are going to work together to assemble a compendium of the best practices in the world today regarding those foreign fighters, and we intend to join together in order to bring this to the United Nations meeting next month and put it on the agenda in a way that will elicit support from source countries as well as those countries of concern. Earlier today, as you all know, we signed a force posture agreement that will further strengthen and deepen the U.S.-Australian defense relationship, and we agreed to expand our trilateral cooperation with Japan. So you can see that we covered a range of very important issues in the Asia-Pacific region, including our commitment to the peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. In the United States, I want to make this clear, is absolutely prepared to improve relations with North Korea if North Korea will honor its international obligations. It's that simple. But make no mistake, we are also prepared to increase pressure, including through strong sanctions and further isolation, if North Korea chooses the path of confrontation. So I join Secretary Hagel in thanking Foreign Minister Bishop and Defense Minister Johnston for very productive discussions over the past day, and we all look forward to continuing our work together in the years to come in order to address these complex challenges.
Laura Dace from Sky News. Secretary Kerry, Secretary Hagel, thank you. Ministers, thank you. I wanted to first go to Russia, and our Australian government has talked about greater sanctions on Russia, leaving that option open, uranium perhaps. Secretary Kerry, is that a path you would like to see Australia go down? There's also the question of Vladimir Putin attending the G20 summit. I wondered if you have a comment on that. And also, as I guess a little bit out of that direct realm, China in all of this. We've seen the US and EU impose quite strong sanctions against Russia in the last couple of months, but China has, I think, helped to dilute that in some ways. If you, Secretary Kerry, could address those questions, also Minister Bishop as well.
Well, thank you very much. On the subject of sanctions with respect to Russia, we are very understanding of our friend Australia's deep, deep anger and its need for justice with respect to what has happened. This is an unconscionable crime on a huge international order. The findings already without the full investigation being done, and we are pressing for a full investigation because nothing is complete until you have a full investigation. But there is no question, and we've said this publicly previously, but that this type of weapon and all the evidence of it was seen on our imagery. We saw this takeoff. We saw the trajectory. We saw the hit. We saw this airplane disappear from a radar screen. So there's really no mystery about where it came from and where these weapons have come from. But we need to have the complete investigation, obviously, to legitimize whatever steps are going to be taken as we go down the road. And that's why we're all pressing so hard for that. The Foreign Minister of Australia traveled to New York, made an eloquent plea, working with our ambassador and others there, Frans Timmermans of the Dutch Foreign Minister, spoke eloquently about what had happened. And the world can't just sort of move by this and gloss by it. People need to remember this because holding people accountable is essential, not just to justice for what happened, but to deterrence and prevention in the future. And we don't want to see these kinds of things ever repeated again. So we're open, but we haven't made any decisions. I'm not sure Australia has either yet. We need to see what's happening. But our hope and prayer, our hope is that in the next days and weeks, we could find a way for President Poroshenko and Ukraine to be able to work with the Russians to provide the humanitarian assistance necessary in the East, to facilitate the thoroughness of the investigation, to begin to bring the separatists to the degree that they are Ukrainian into the political process. And for those who are not Ukrainian, they need to leave the country. And there needs to be a process worked out where the supplies stop coming in, both in money and arms and support and people, and Ukraine is allowed to begin to protect its sovereignty and define its future. Our hope is that that can happen through the diplomatic process, but we've all learned that we need to be cautious and strong at the same time in our responses and clear about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. With respect to the G20 summit, et cetera, no decisions have been made at this point in time. I think a lot of the attitudes about that issue from the various countries attending can frankly be determined and impacted to some degree on what happens in these next days and weeks. And finally, with respect to China and what is going on, we have said again and again that we just had a strategic and economic dialogue in China. Secretary Jack Lew of the Treasury and I were there with 2 days of discussions. And we made it very clear with China that we welcome the rise of China as a global partner, hopefully, as a powerful economy, as a full participating, constructive member of the international community. And we want China to participate in constructive ways, whether it's in the South China Sea or with respect to Japan and South Korea, with North Korea, with other issues that we face. We are not seeking conflict and confrontation, and our hope is that China will likewise take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of it to be that cooperative partner. And so there are always differences, shades of, there are differences with respect to certain issues, and we've agreed to try to find those things where we can really cooperate. We're cooperating on Afghanistan. We're cooperating on non-proliferation with respect to Iran. We're cooperated to get the chemical weapons out of Syria. We're cooperating on counterterrorism. We're cooperating on nuclear weaponry and on the reduction of nuclear arms. So there are plenty of big issues on which we cooperate with Russia, even now, every day. And our hope is that on those things where we've obviously had some disagreements with China or with Russia, that we can both find a diplomatic path forward, because everybody in the world understands the world will be better off if great power nations are finding ways to cooperate, not to confront each other. Let me just begin by congratulating Dr. Haider al-Abadi on his nomination, which now offers him an opportunity to be able to form a government over the next 30 days. And we urge him to form a new cabinet as swiftly as possible. And the U.S. does stand ready to fully support a new and inclusive Iraqi government, particularly in its fight against ISIL. Now, I'm not going to get into the details today before a new prime minister is there and a government is there, and we've talked to them and we know what they think their needs are and how they define the road ahead. But I will tell you that without any question, we are prepared to consider additional political, economic, and security options as Iraq starts to build a new government, and very much calculated to try to help stabilize the security situation, to expand economic development, and to strengthen the democratic institutions. Those will be the guidelines. We also would note that there are already a significant group of programs in place under the Strategic Framework Agreement. And we, with a new government in place, would absolutely look to provide additional options. We would consider those options for sure in an effort to strengthen an effort. Let me be very clear. We have always wanted an inclusive, participatory government that represents the interests of Shia, Kurd, Sunni, minorities, all Iraqis. That's the goal. And our hope is that when there is a new government, we will, all of us in the international community, be able to work with them in order to guarantee that outstanding issues that have just stood there, absolutely frozen for years now, like the oil revenue law or the constitutional reform, all of these things need to be resolved. And that will really determine the road ahead. Now, with respect to the Kurds, we welcome increased coordination and support between the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish forces. That is taking place right now. It's quite unique. And we think that's a signal of a growing potential for cooperation between Baghdad and Erbil. So, as we've said last week, ISIL has secured certain heavy weaponry, and the Kurds need additional arms. And what is happening now is, through the government in Baghdad, some of that assistance is being provided directly to the Kurds. I think that raises as many questions about the possibility of greater cooperation as it does with the possibility of further efforts for separation. What I do know is, from my own meetings with President Barzani recently, he is very committed to this transition in Baghdad, in Iraq, in the government. He is committed to trying to be a force for a strong federal government that works for all Iraqis, and that's the only subject on the table at this point in time.
Secretaries, Ministers, Greg Jennett from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. This is to any or all of you, but perhaps starting with you, Secretary Kerry. Following on from that question on Iraq, and noting that you don't want to get into details, but that stabilising security is an option that the US is prepared to explore with the government there. What are the circumstances in which the US could look to allies, including Australia, to support security with further military commitments? If you could outline at least the parameters in which you would start that conversation. And also on homecoming jihadists from the Middle East, what is the shared approach? Practically, what sort of initiatives are we talking about? Is this things before prosecution, after incarceration, before interrogation? Is there any example of the types of actions you'd like to see the world take jointly? Well,
let me let a couple of my colleagues I'll turn to Julie to address the issue on the foreign fighters, because we had a pretty robust discussion, and perhaps even Mr. Johnson and Hagel want to tackle that. So let me just answer the first part of the question, and they can answer the second. The question is, how can we look towards this issue of stabilization and military assistance? And you said, where would the discussion begin? Well, let me tell you in the simplest terms where the discussion begins. There will be no reintroduction of American combat forces into Iraq. That is the beginning of the discussion. This is a fight that Iraqis need to join on behalf of Iraq. And our hope is, and the reason President Obama has been so clear about wanting to get the government formation before beginning to tackle ISIL in the most significant way, accepting the kind of emergency circumstances that have arisen, is because if you don't have a government that is inclusive and that works, nothing else will work, plain and simply. So you have to have a government that can begin to be inclusive, where the forces of Iraq are not a personal force defined by one particular sect and sworn to allegiance to one particular leader, but they truly represent Iraq and Iraq's future in a broad-based sense. And I think that everybody understands that is the direction that we have to go. Now, lots of countries who have an interest in stability in the region have already offered different kinds of assistance of one kind or another. But nobody, I think, is looking towards a return to the road that we've traveled. What we're really looking for here is a way to support Iraq, support their forces with either training or equipment or assistance of one kind or another that can help them to stand on their own 2 feet and defend their nation. That's the goal. That's where the conversation begins, whoever is Prime Minister. I think everybody is crystal clear about that. We are convinced that with a unified effort by Iraqis, and particularly if there is a return to the kind of localized efforts that existed in the Sons of Anbar, or the Iraqi, or the Anbar Awakening, as it's referred to, that there will be plenty of opportunity here for a pushback against ISIL forces, which is why the restoration of a unified, inclusive government is so critical as a starting point. I think the President felt that that process was well enough along the way with the selection of a speaker, the selection of a president, and the clear movement of people towards a candidate for Prime Minister, that he felt comfortable that the urgency of the situation of protecting the potential of people moving towards Erbil, or the extraordinary atrocities that were beginning to take place with respect to the Yazidis, that it was critical to begin to move in that regard. And that's why he made that decision, and I think it was a wise decision. This image, perhaps even an iconic photograph that Julie has just referred to, is really one of the most disturbing, stomach-turning, grotesque photographs ever displayed of a 7-year-old child holding a severed head up with pride and with the support and encouragement of a parent with brothers there. That child should be in school, and that child should be out learning about a future. That child should be playing with other kids, not holding a severed head and out in the field of combat. This is utterly disgraceful, and it underscores the degree to which ISIL is so far beyond the pale with respect to any standard by which we judge even terrorist groups, that Al-Qaeda shunted them aside. And that's why they represent the threat that they represent. And it's no accident that every country in the region is opposed to ISIL. So this threat is so real, and African the North African president of the country recently told me that 1,800 identified citizens of that country had gone to Syria to fight. Believe it or not, 1,100 of them they knew had already been killed because their bodies had been returned, or they were tallied as killed. But that leaves 700 or 800 still out there that they fear are going to return to that country, knowing how to fix an IED, knowing how to arm weapons, knowing how to explode a bomb, knowing how to build a suicide vest, or something like that. And this ideology is without one redeeming quality of offering people a job or a health care system or an education or anything other than saying don't live any other way but the way we tell you. So this is serious business. And we understand that. And I think the world is beginning to come to grips with the fact, the degree to which this is unacceptable. And we have a responsibility to take this to the United Nations and to the world so that all countries involved take measures ahead of time to prevent the return of these fighters and the chaos and havoc that could come with that. And I just wanted to underscore that with Minister Bishop, because we're all joined together in this effort. And that's why we're going to take it to the United Nations in the fall and try to get best practices put together by which all countries can begin to act together in unison in order to react to it.
Yeah, Leslie Rawton from Reuters. Please excuse if I don't stand up. I've got too much equipment going here. Turning back to Iraq, you said that the US was prepared to consider security, political and economic options as Iraq forms this new government. Can you get into more specifics about that? We've heard some vague statements on how you are prepared to support. Does this include further airstrikes, to push back ISIS? Once the government comes in, how do you secure that stability? And then number two, on Ukraine, NATO Secretary General Rasmussen said today there's a high probability of a Russian intervention in Ukraine. What specific steps, again, are you taking through diplomatic channels to address this? You talked about your hopes in the next days and weeks you could find a way for President Poroshenko and Ukraine to be able to work with the Russians. Are you talking about a new diplomatic effort here, and what are you talking about? Thanks.
Well, let me make it clear, with respect to Ukraine, diplomatic efforts have never ceased. It's not a question of a new one. It's a question of ongoing diplomatic efforts. We have never stopped. The President has not stopped. The Vice President, myself, have all been in touch with the top leadership of Ukraine, with leadership of Russia, and others. The President of the United States talked to President Putin a few days ago. I talked to Foreign Minister Lavrov just a couple of days ago. I talked to President Poroshenko a few days ago. There are a lot of conversations taking place. And even now, as we stand here, there are efforts being made with our friends, with Germany, with the Ukrainians, with Russia, with others, to try to see if there's a way to work out a way forward on the humanitarian delivery, with direct contact with the ICRC. There is direct contact with the Germans and others in this effort. And the hope is that through the meetings that will take place this week, there is a way to find a means that is acceptable to deliver humanitarian assistance without the guise of a military delivery in an effort to do so against the will and wishes of the country where it is being delivered and against the norms of the ICRC, the International Red Cross, and how it would react to that. So that's the effort that's underway now. It's been a consistent, continued diplomatic effort to try to find a way forward. But obviously the humanitarian assistance needs to get there, and there are a clear set of meetings scheduled, so there's a time frame within which we think we're operating, which is why I mentioned that. With respect to Iraq and the stability, I think Chuck Hagel should speak specifically to any of the security components of that, but I'd just say on the economic and political front, the best thing for stability in Iraq is for an inclusive government to bring the disaffected parties to the table and work with them in order to make sure there is the kind of sharing of power and decision-making that people feel confident the government represents all of their interests. And if that begins to happen, then there is a way for both investment, trade, economic, other realities to help sustain and build that kind of stability. But if you don't have the prerequisite, which President Obama identified at the outset, of an inclusive, working government, there's no chance for any of that. That's why we think the steps taken, the selection of a speaker, the selection of a president, and now a prime minister designate who has an opportunity to be able to form a government are just essential prerequisites to this process of providing stability. Do you want to talk to the security?
Thank you.